This video is about your proposal for your paper that's due at the end of the semester. The paper has three main components: the proposal, which we're going to talk about now, the table section, which will incorporate a lot of your data and your basic analysis, and then the actual paper at the end, which will essentially be the result of this effort. So this is sort of scaffolding to get you prepared to make sure you're on the right track so that you don't waste a lot of time later when the big actual paper is due. The proposal is going to be drawing on data that you can find on my website. Essentially, it is finding one particular variable you think is pretty interesting, like, say, murder rates, for example. Then you identify three very different variables that you think cause murder rates. It's important that not only are these variables different from murder rates, but they're also different from each other, very different from each other. So we might say income. We might say population density. We might say education spending. Now, for each of these three things, we can tell a reasonable story for why that particular variable would cause murder rates. Like, as people get wealthier, they are less desperate for money. They're less willing to commit murder in order to get some money. Population density increases. We could tell a story that if population density increases, then it's easier to get away with murder because you can more disappear into a larger crowd, so that will cause murder rates to increase. We can say education, because as education spending increases, murder rates are sometimes, like, murder is often associated with crimes of passion, so maybe they learn to better control themselves or plan ahead in the process of education. Now, note the way that I did that. Each one of these variables stands alone. I did not say, oh, education spending might cause murder rates because if people are more educated, they make more money. And, more money means you're less likely to commit murder. No. I did it on its own. I did not rely on this variable. I did not tell a story where this causes this, then causes this. I drew a direct line from education spending to murder rates. That was independent of income. And that's how you should structure your proposal. It can be very, very short. It's just three different explanations of three different variables, all causing the same variable. Again, these are also very different. While average income and education spending seem to overlap quite a bit, they are not so redundant. Like, some people will say things like ones that you should not use are ones like the number of births and the number of deaths. That's very redundant because it's going to strictly depend on population. Or people will say average income and average consumption, or the average amount of money people make and then the average amount of money people spend. That's also pretty redundant. There's a lot of overlap there. Those are very similar things. It's also very obvious if you want to say income causes consumption. Well, yeah, of course it does. Try to avoid obvious connections. In fact, I encourage you to be creative. You can pull any number. I have a whole bunch of data available. I'll show it to you in a minute. You should try to think outside the box. You should try to come up with some odd examples. One variable, though, you should not use: population. Don't use population. That population variable is there to make adjustments for other variables I might get. Like, for example, I will sometimes get data on total deaths. But as mentioned, total deaths is really going to depend on how many people live in a particular place. So I use the population variable to adjust for population to get something that is raw. Similarly, education spending by itself isn't going to be terribly helpful. You really want education per pupil, education spending adjusted for population. whenever possible, whenever it makes sense, always adjust for population. You can tell it needs to be adjusted for population because if one additional person would automatically and naturally increase this variable, then it's a variable that should be adjusted for population. So you would never use total murders. You would use murder rates, or murders per 100,000 people. You would never use total income. You would always use average income. It's also known as GDP per capita, or GDP per person. If you know your economics, you know the GDP in a country is the total income in a country, by definition. Population density, though, doesn't need to be adjusted for population because it's really adjusted for size, for how physically large a place is. Another obvious one I get is HDI. HDI is a fine variable. HDI stands for Human Development Index. It's a fine variable to use. It is essentially a measure of how developed a country is. The problem is people will then look at what HDI is, and then they will use the components of HDI to predict HDI. So, for example, one of the things that determines what a country's Human Development Index is its education level, how educated its people are. And so people will say, well, I predict education levels. I think education levels will predict HDI. It's like, well, of course they do. They do by definition. And this is another obvious example, like using income to predict consumption. Don't do that. It's boring. Think creatively. So here's my website. As per normal, if you go to my teaching section, you go to BSAD 210, you'll see all the data for this class, and at the very bottom right here, you see memo data sets. All right, mouse over, it's a link. We get it, and it will download. Okay, let's hit enable editing because I'm just used to enable editing. So right now, based on how it's saved, and this might change in the future, but right now, based on how it saves it, it defaults to state data. There's also country data here as well. So there are two different sources of data you can use. You can use state level data where the element of the data is state. And so we have the state of Alabama, for example, and then we have how big it is and the percent of the land that's water and the unemployment rate in 2012, median income. We have lots of data. Here's data on migration. Again, this is the total migration. You don't want that. You want to use the migration that's adjusted for population. We have demographic data on ethnicity. Here's crime data. Here's SAT scores. For SAT scores, by the way, you should always use the adjusted combined. If you want to use SATs as a measure of maybe how educated people are, don't use the combined score. Use the adjusted combined. Because some states require everyone to take the SAT, or large sections, they have districts that everyone has to take it. And so if people have to take it, then people who normally would do bad take it, and that drags down the average. So the adjusted combined adjust for that. Like here's a fine example. Maine, 93% of students took it. Louisiana, just 9%. So the fact that Louisiana has a higher combined score, over 1,600 versus less than 1,400. Oh, it seems like Louisiana is doing super well. No, it's because only the people who really think they'll do well take it. So when we adjust for that, and that's what the adjusted combined score is, you see actually Louisiana has a lower score than Maine. So use this adjusted combined if you want to use SAT. The participation rate in itself, I guess, could use, but typically this is the one people use. And then here's our spending for public elementary school. Here's election results from 2012, election results from 2016, the fiscal ratings, and children waiting to be adopted. Now, when the 2020 census comes out and that data comes out, I want to completely revise and update this because some of this data is getting pretty old. But for our purposes for right now, it's good. Note that not everything is taken at 2012 too as well. Ideally, everything will be taken at exactly the same time. But it's still workable This is 2016 versus 2012. Not huge differences are going to be between 2012 and 2016, at least for these variables. So they're fine. We also have country data, where the element is the country. There's a lot more variables here, but there's also a lot of blank spots because we don't have as consistent information. But it's still very helpful. And again, the whole idea is to come up with some sort of creative thinking. Like this is percent of the country that's forest. This is the latitude where the country's capital is. So this kind of gives you an idea on climate, right? If you take the absolute value, it gives you an idea how cold roughly the country is. This is sugar consumption. This is suicide for men and suicide for women and suicide overall. Some of this data, again, I think this is a lot of in the 2000s. More data I'd like to update. Years in school, right? We have a lot of potential variables. So there's a lot you can draw on: agricultural land, murder rates, population density, BMI for male and female. So again, you're encouraged to be creative. There's GDP per cap, by the way, the average income. Just again, don't use population. Right? Don't use population data in here, and don't use anything that should be adjusted for population. Like don't use births per thousand. Don't use total deaths. Use deaths per 1,000. Don't use consumption in millions. Use average consumption, which adjusts for population. This variable right here, right to work, column N, this is called a dummy variable. We're going to discuss dummy variables later in the unit. Essentially, it's asking if this particular state is a right to work state. A right to work state in 2012. And right to work means that you do not have to join a union in order to work particular jobs. So some jobs are set up where you have to join a union. Those are illegal in Alabama, but they are legal in Alaska. They are illegal in Arizona. They are legal in California. Right? In California, your job can require you to join a union. In, say, Florida, it is not allowed to. So this is a potentially interesting variable that you might want to use. And then that, though, you're encouraged. Oh, obviously, percent water does not need to be adjusted for population. Is another such example. Percent of the area, the size of the state, that's water. Total Obama, don't use that. Use percent Obama, stuff like that. In sum, 3 different variables that all cause the same variable standing on their own, and make sure that they're very different from one another.